Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed for part 2 of the May Q&A series, the second of probably 2 parts. Normally we've done 3 for these series, but with Computex just around the corner, we have to cut it a little bit short, but then potentially we'll be doing a Q&A actually at Computex.
So it's like a delayed part 3.
Yeah, maybe a delayed part 3, just looking at some of the cool stuff. Maybe we'll do it on the show floor from a hotel or something, but yeah, that should be a bit of fun. But for now, 2 parts. This is the second part. Check out part 1 on the channel, which is already up now. And yeah, let's get into answering some questions. But before we do,
today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Thermal Grizzly and their new 12th gen CPU contact frame by DeBauer. It's well known that the integrated loading mechanism, or ILM, of the LJ1700 sockets bends 12th gen CPUs, leading to an uneven contact surface that reduces cooling performance. Solving this issue, the contact frame replaces the ILM, allowing for a much more even contact with the CPU's IHS and the base of your cooler, which in turn reduces operating temperatures. Installation's quick and easy, and thanks to the use of anodized aluminium, the contact frame is non-conductive. And then, for those of you who wish to further maximize contact, Thermal Grizzly now offers an optional lapping tool, so for more information, please check the link in the video description.
What is your stance on XMP and EXPO is overclocking and could void your warranty? Would you consider doing stock memory speed reviews if AMD and Intel don't change their warranty policy? I know you get review guides. Do manufacturers ask you to run XMP/EXPO? So I'm sure this is coming up because of the whole ASUS motherboard controversy, largely investigated by Gamers Nexus, where, what was it? Was it a 7800X3D blew up on
there
one of their boards?
There was the AM5 burning up socket CPU.
Yeah. Basically, whole controversy where they made BIOS updates saying, like, if you install this BIOS update, it voids your warranty. If you use EXPO and XMP, it voids your warranty. I mean, it's a difficult one because overclocking is typically something that does void the warranty. And I think if we're talking about like CPU overclocking, so not the memory side of things, but like CPU core overclocking, I think it's probably fair that that is something that isn't covered under warranty. You're adding extra voltage and stuff, reduce the longevity. It's not default behavior.
Yeah, you're running heavily out of spec. But at the same time, good luck proving that ever happened.
Exactly. But I think with memory overclocking, especially if it's something that the manufacturer is recommending that you do and is heavily advertising it as a feature.
Yeah, feature of the product.
Then the motherboard and CPU should be supporting that up to, some limit. Like, it shouldn't be just you're slapping in DDR5 8000 and you're cranking up the voltage to get it to work. And there's a limit that should be there. But if they're saying like the optimal speed for this CPU is DDR5 6000, but officially we're supporting DDR5 4800 or whatever the case is, then clearly if they're saying the 6000 speed is optimal, then that should be covered under warranty. I think that's a very reasonable expectation.
Really any EXPO or XMP, it doesn't matter if it's 8000 or whatever, like if it's been validated, because it's not, the memory makers can't make random memory say this needs 1 point whatever volts and then you put it in the board. That's not how it works. Like, they've got to validate it, and the board configures itself when it identifies that kit.
Yeah.
So, but at the end of the day, look, I know this has been blown up to be a recent drama and it's because of ASUS's poor handling of that, so that's all valid and fine, but none of this is new. Like, this has been the way it's been for over a decade now. Whenever you enable these, extreme memory profiles or whatever, it's running technically out of spec, and therefore it's not technically, covered by warranty. That's always been AMD and Intel's stance, but no one's ever, had a CPU die with XMP enabled, whether it was related or otherwise, and then submitted the CPU for a RMA process and like, we can see here you had XMP enabled, therefore we're declining your warranty request. That's never happened. They'll just replace the CPU. If there's no physical damage to the CPU, like, you've put a screwdriver through it or something like that, I've not heard of people having their warranties declined for, a CPU that looks like it should work, but just doesn't. And then obviously ones that have a giant bulge under them because way too much SoC voltage, you're not going to get requests denied at this point in time anyway. So yeah, not a new issue, not a new stance. As for how we would test, at the end of the day, we're going to test how most of you guys will use your CPUs and your CPU, your systems. So if everybody did memory tuning, that was just a thing that everyone did, that would be how we would test pretty much by default, because that's how everyone tests. But pretty much everyone in our audience enables memory profiles straight out of the gate. So that's how we benchmark rather than the stock baseline settings. Because the stock baseline settings are hugely misleading for our audience. Doesn't hurt Intel CPUs too much, but massively reduces the performance of Ryzen CPUs. And again, if everyone was testing that, if everyone was using their computer that way, we wouldn't enable XMP, but pretty much everyone does. So
like, I sort of get the argument of like, hey, what company X is doing dodgy thing, and they're saying one thing, but then it's actually not technically supported via warranty or something, and therefore you have to punish them in the benchmark charts by disabling these features. I get that opinion. Like I understand where you're coming from, but I think ultimately our testing, as you've said, is trying to reflect the configurations that you, the viewer, the user, are making, as opposed to what's the correct way and how are we going to punish the different manufacturers. Like if you start diving into that, it gets very, very messy as to what settings you are and aren't, enabling because of punishing reasons or making it fair or whatever. It's like you want it to be fair because you're testing it the same way, but the fairness has to come from what are the viewers doing, how do people actually use these, and then applying that to everyone. So yeah, I don't necessarily agree with like, let's turn off EXPO for AMD testing, but leave it enabled for Intel because AMD doesn't give warranty support and Intel does. Now, I don't think that's actually the case, but
yeah, they're pretty much the same.
They're pretty much the same, but that's not a method that I think makes a lot of sense.
Look, in our opinion, like we're totally on your side. Like it's a garbage position for these companies to take. It's anti-consumer. It's a crap way of going about it. But at the end of the day, it's just so stupid and pointless on their behalf because they don't know if you've enabled EXPO in the BIOS. So if your CPU happens to die from something that's unrelated or related, whatever, with EXPO enabled, and you just submit it for an RMA, again, if it doesn't look like you've thrown it off a building or something, it's not physically damaged, they should just replace it.
Yeah, but I mean, these companies like ambiguity in their warranty policies. They're designed that way on purpose so that if there is some sort of dubious claim, they have an easy way out of not doing it. Like if they're suddenly getting a ton of warranty claims and it's costing them a ton of money, they're going to start scrutinizing the policies a bit more closely. They're going to be like, well, technically, blah, blah, blah. So, I personally don't like that. I think we would prefer to be cut and dry. Like, we definitely do support CPU warranty claims with EXPO enabled. But companies aren't going to do that. Their legal teams aren't going to allow that to happen. They want the ambiguity. And then that's just the unfortunate reality of how these policies are made these days.
And it's hard to get much change there because it's been that way for, like I said, well over a decade now.
Yeah.
And it's really, in most instances, it's a bit of a non-issue.
I see some people saying that based on the die size of the 4060 Ti, it probably was supposed to be the 4050. Has the renaming of 4080 12GB messed up their GPU lineup?
Well, okay, I think I see what they're saying there. So historically, that's what it should have been.
Yeah.
But then when you go the other way, you talk about the naming, it should have been further up the stack.
Yeah, I mean, basically, if we had a 4080 12GB instead of the 4070 Ti, then you run through that scenario and theoretically the 4070 would have become the 4070 Ti and the 4060 Ti would have become the 4070, not the 4050.
That's right, yeah.
So I guess it could have been even worse if they didn't rename the 4080 12GB. That's the only conclusion I can come to, is that they were planning to have this as an even higher tier product. I mean, the 4070 as is being sold as a $600 GPU, which previously would have been the price of the 4070 Ti. So, I mean, I don't think the plan was ever to call this a 4050. No,
they've walked it back, if anything.
Yeah, it's gone the other way. And I mean, I totally agree with the point that if you look at how much the die is cut down relative to the flagship GPU in terms of not just core configuration, but memory and all those sorts of areas, then yeah, it looks like a 4050 type of GPU.
Yeah,
so that makes sense. Like, that's a fair point.
Yeah, it should have been an RTX 4050, but if Nvidia had their way, it'd be an RTX 4070.
Yes, I believe that's what they would have attempted.
Yep,
if they didn't rename it.
Yeah, sounds crazy, but that's where they were going.
I mean, I guess, like, if they'd sold it at $500 price and named it a 4070, it would have offered roughly the same performance with the same VRAM, which again, you say, now that's awful, which is definitely true. But I think throughout this generation, it's been very clear that Nvidia is trying to use this generation to sell features as opposed to performance.
Yeah.
It's very much hey, the performance is the same, but our 4060 Ti has frame generation, so the real gain, according to them using non-apples to apples comparisons, is that it's 50% faster or some number that they come up with.
Yep.
So that's how they would have sold it. I think that hasn't worked, and that's why they've changed things up. It clearly was never going to work, but these companies try things.
They did that with. It was a more compelling thing at the time because people were way more hyped. They did that from the GeForce 10 series to the GeForce 20 series. No improvement in terms of cost per frame, like very little. But everyone was just super duper hyped for ray tracing and DLSS, both of which were garbage technologies for how long?
Certainly until the 30 series came out.
Well, the original DLSS was so bad they had to actually reinvent the technology essentially, and they've done a good job of that, but it was terrible, as you pointed out. And then ray tracing, I mean, we're only starting to get there now.
I mean, I think DLSS 3 has had a better debut than those technologies
Absolutely.
by far. Like DLSS 3 is usable, whereas ray tracing and DLSS back in the day were like, let's turn that off. So yeah, it seems like maybe Nvidia's doing this sort of TikTok sort of cycle where they go value features, or price to performance features, and we seem to be in that feature cycle.
Yeah, you get a performance uplift every like 5-ish years.
Yeah, so price to performance increases, but no new features, and then they've done this feature generation. So, yeah, I mean, potentially it would have been even worse. So, thankfully, it's not that bad, but realistically, it didn't save the 4060 Ti at all. It's still a garbage product either way. So, yeah, that's just the unfortunate reality there. I think this is a great follow-up question to what we were just talking about. Do you think the 4060 Ti is the worst mid-range GPU in the history of PCIe GPUs? Are you surprised by how terrible it is? That's a pretty harsh question. I'm not familiar with the entire PCIe
it's hard
generation.
to
You're going back a long time.
It's hard to recall everything. It's certainly by far the worst that I can recall. Whether it's the absolute worst, I'm not sure. People will be quick to point out the 6500 XT, which unbelievably garbage product that I destroyed in my review, and most people agreed with. That product is technically a much worse product. It was released in a completely different market. Still, absolutely garbage product, in my opinion, should have never existed. But that's an entry-level product anyway. So...
Yeah, I think it's, if we're talking about the worst ever, that would be up there. Like, if you're making a short list of candidates, 6500 XT easily makes the short list.
That's the worst GPU I can remember reviewing. I mean, obviously, there's been really bad things like the DDR4 GT 1030, but they...
Yeah, there's been some deceptive releases for sure over the years. Some not great practices. And there's been some... there's definitely been as well products from brands that are not necessarily, technically bad, but have been very underwhelming for various reasons, like price or whatever.
The worst is it's hard to pin that down because the 6500 XT was the worst for those sort of reasons. 4 gigabyte of VRAM, 4 PCIe lanes, no hardware encoding engine, 2 display port outputs.
It really was bad.
It was the biggest piece of crap. It was was it $300? It sounds absurd saying that out loud.
Was it really $300? No.
I think it was.
No.
Check. I think
was it $200?
No.
There's no way it was. There's
check
no
the
way.
MSRP. I don't know. For some reason, I'm thinking it was $300.
2 hours later.
Okay, so I checked. 6500 XT at a $200 MSRP, but during the pandemic, it did sell for $250 to $300 at the start there. So that's, I think, what we were sort of getting confused.
I remember seeing them for sale for $300, and I was
and that's just a little. Nowadays, I believe they're like $160, $150, which is still.
That should be like $100.
Yeah, so that product, I think, from a technical perspective and a pricing perspective, was very bad. I think the GeForce product, it's probably on it too has technical issues. The 8 gig GPU, 8 gigabytes of VRAM is not sufficient. The memory bus also causes lesser performance than the 3060 Ti in some scenarios. So it doesn't have as many problems. It doesn't have PCIe issues.
Well, its problem is the price, really. The VRAM's not even a problem. If it was $200, it'd be fantastic. If it was half price, funnily enough, it would be fantastic.
If it was a 4050 priced at even $250, it'd be like
$250 would be a great product, yeah.
So I think based on this sort of I think based on this quick discussion and sort of going through our thoughts now, surely the 6500 XT is worse.
But that's an entry level card. If we're talking more mid range cards, then this has certainly been,
It's the worst mid-range card for...
as far as back as I can remember.
I think overall, I'd probably give the 6500 XT the overall, like just the technical problems make it.
But then again, what's the criteria? Because the absolute worst, most disgusting thing I've looked at was the DDR4 GT 1030.
That was bad.
Like
very bad.
the 1030 is already not a good product that you probably shouldn't buy. But we know, people at the lower end of the market and pre-builts and stuff, they're getting something for their kids to play, Fortnite or something like that. It can do that if it's got, the appropriate memory. But using DDR4 memory made that card completely unusable, and they just quietly released that with...
Okay, what about this system? The worst priced GPU is probably the 4060 Ti. It needs a big price reduction to be competitive. The 6500 XT is probably technically the worst GPU in terms of technical hardware. And I think the GT 1030 DDR4 is the most deceptive product because the whole goal of that product, as you say, was to ruin people's OEM systems. So I think with those three, you've sort of got covering different bases there. And then, you can argue as to overall which is the worst.
The memory for that product must have been so affordable as well. Nvidia really just does not mind rolling gamers to save a few pennies on memory, do they? It's like their thing. It's like their MO at this point. It's crazy.
I see a lot of tech reviewers criticize AMD and Nvidia for having the same tier graphics card targeting the same resolution while gaming over multiple generations. Do you think this is fair given that games are constantly getting more graphically demanding to accommodate the new hardware? Do you think games are getting graphically demanding at a faster rate than GPUs are improving to catch up, or vice versa?
Well, we've definitely got 8 GB stagnation, don't we? I think it's more the fact that you buy a monitor, and we've talked about buying, investing in a higher quality monitor, make sure it's high refresh rate, good image quality. Because if you buy yourself a good quality monitor, you can generally hold on to that for a very, very long period of time, which I typically have mine for up to 10 years. So if you've sort of been the kind of person that spends $300 to maybe $500 on a GPU, let's say between $300 and $400, because historically that's bought you a GPU that can certainly game at 1440p.
Well, the 3060 Ti was advertised as a 1440p
That's
GPU.
$400 previous generation GPU.
5700 XT, 6700 XT were also advertised as 1440p.
So let's say $400. You typically spend around $400 US on your GPU every 3 years or so, whatever it may be. You're a 1440p gamer. Like you've invested, let's say, big money in a 1440p high refresh rate monitor. What do those things cost?
Well, it's not even investing big money. For the last 2 years, you've been able to buy that monitor for $250 to $300.
But even if you bought one 6 years ago.
If you bought one 6 years ago, you were spending $500.
Yeah, so you spent $500 back then. It's still a good monitor, right?
Yeah, of course.
And you spend $400 on your GPU to use that monitor. And then you spent $400 the previous generation. You're like, well, I'm looking at upgrading now. You don't want to spend $400 to go backwards.
That's true.
So games get more demanding and GPUs get more powerful, and sort of roughly the price to performance tier you're used to should stay relatively similar, inflation or whatever. But it shouldn't. And again, when we talk about inflation, it's like, inflation's a thing. We don't think it's a myth. But it doesn't mean that you once you spent $400 to get that level of performance, and now you've got to spend $800.
Yeah, I mean, the real thing, this question brings up, are games outpacing GPUs? Games obviously use more features, which is true. But I think the idea is that a typical $400 new generation GPU would provide the performance uplift that caters to those games' new graphics features.
And it largely does.
So, yeah,
the VRAM's the problem.
You got your 1440p GPU previously, which played games of that era using reasonable quality settings at good frame rates. Games get more demanding. The new GPU at the same price should be 20 to 30% faster, which means that the games, which are going to be roughly that much more intensive in the future, it's still running in that tier. And that's how you encourage people to upgrade every so often with their GPU cycle. They buy a new product that allows them to get that performance boost to get back to where they were when they bought their previous card. Mm-hmm. So, over time you sort of dip, and then you get the big spike and dip and spike. And that's how those buying decisions go. And going backwards makes no sense. And I think as well, there's been all this discussion from Nvidia and AMD about these GPUs are for 1080p gaming. So many gamers are 1080p gamers and so on. Let's look at the Steam survey. So look how many people are still 1080p gamers. And the Steam survey, while it is, I'm sure the numbers are to some degree accurate, you have to take those numbers in the context that they're presented in, which is that it's not a certain type of gamer. It's literally everyone with Steam installed.
That's right, laptop gamers on integrated graphics.
So you can look at the survey and look at the bottom percentage of gamers that are surveyed on Steam, and you'll find things like 10% of gamers do not have a CPU that supports AVX2. Now that means that a lot of modern games will not launch. So you're already talking about the very bottom percent of that entire group of people.
They're playing Dota or something.
That have games that don't, like modern games won't run.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of people still with 4 and 8 gigabytes of system memory, which again, is a lot of games won't run. There's a significant percentage of Steam survey people with 4 CPU core CPUs. Again, a lot of games will not run on those bits of hardware. And that's because, as you say, they're playing Dota.
And that's not justification for charging gamers $200 for a new quad core. It's not justification for charging gamers $400 for an 8 gigabyte VRAM graphics card because most gamers have 8 gigabytes. Like
it's the numbers have to be taken into context. Like, okay, 70% of gamers still use 1080p displays, but what percentage of those 1080p gamers are playing games that someone realistically buying a GPU is buying it for? Like, you're not buying...
And what percentage of those gamers are looking at spending $400 on the next GPU and not like a secondhand GPU or the cheapest thing they can get their hands on?
Like a 1080p gamer who has a low-end GPU who plays Dota or, text-based games or something and has Steam installed is not the target audience for a 4060 Ti. And the question is, of that 70%, how many people would realistically consider a 4060 Ti? And I'd say that there's a significant portion of those gamers who are they would never buy that product. Like they're gaming on a laptop. Lots of laptops have 1080p displays, or they're on low-end hardware, or whatever. They're just not that sort of gamer. And so the argument for resolution should always be: what does someone who is the target audience for this card and would realistically be buying a card like this? What are they going to be doing? They're going to be playing the latest titles. They're going to be playing Jedi Survivor and The Last of Us. And yes, a lot of people will be playing multiplayer games, but the type of buyer who buys a 4060 Ti for multiplayer isn't playing Dota. They're playing Fortnite. They're playing Overwatch. They're playing Call of Duty or Battlefield or those types of multiplayer games that do require a bit more horsepower than integrated graphics on a 1080p laptop. And I think that I find that marketing push really disingenuous, where it's like, oh, we're justifying 1080p for this GPU because everyone on Steam has a 1080p display. But these days, as a display reviewer, it's not like they're very cheap. Like they're entry-level displays.
Yeah.
And most people, in my opinion, should be upgrading to 1440p, which, for me, I can sit here and say everyone should upgrade to 1440p, and people will say, well, I can't afford that, and that's all those reasons are fine. But if you're on a 1080p display and you're tossing up, do I buy a 4060 Ti or a new 1440p display? 100% you should be buying the display. 100% upgrade to 1440p first. Get yourself established with that beautiful high refresh rate, great resolution display, and then think about the GPU upgrade, because it'll be a much more substantial upgrade. And those are my thoughts on 1080p. 1080p is entry level. It's mainstream entry level stuff.
Yeah, if you were making that justification for why you made a $100 4 gigabyte graphics card, and you were like, because most people are at 1080p and they're playing games like Dota, so we just made it... It's like, okay, fair enough. Like, you've sort of...
Yeah, like integrated graphics marketing has always been that, right? Where it's like, we're targeting 720 and 1080p resolutions and people playing Dota.
Yep.
We want to know how good you can run Dota.
Again, doesn't fly for a $400 US GPU. $100 or less, sure.
Yeah, and I think that's the reality. And I think the painful thing was really seeing that these companies have gone backwards with this. Like, what used to be a $400 tier is now a 1080p tier.
Yeah, well, I've talked about... I'm sat here like Alex Jones, going red in the face, punching the desk, throwing paper everywhere, going, they're reconditioning the market, folks, wake up. So...
Do you want to recant your comparison of yourself to Alex Jones, or are you comfortable with that?
I was joking, but you know what I mean? Like, I've said over and over and over again... I'm just laughing. We're going to do that gag. Nvidia's trying to recondition the market. They're trying to recondition gamers into thinking that $400 GPUs are like low-end, basically entry-level.
And AMD attempted that with the 6600. Was it XT that was advertised as 1080p as well? Like, even they were attempting.
I just want to punch the desk and yell now, Tim. Sorry. Can't help myself. End the question. Do you think the terrible value propositions of newer GPUs will hurt sales for new games?
Probably not. Like, it's definitely, I think, hurting enthusiasm for PC gaming in general. So I think less people are going to be excited about upgrading their GPU or building a new PC for gaming as opposed to buying a console or something. I think, these days a lot of people will probably be choosing a PS5 over a PC for gaming because it's just much more affordable and better experience. I think with game sales, though, I think if you're in the PC ecosystem, a lot of people are probably still going to be buying games that they're interested in. They're just not going to run as well. And I think we've seen a lot of that with titles like things like The Last of Us and Jedi Survivor, where, those games run, I wouldn't say well, but they run to a reasonable level on a super high-end system. Like if you've got 7800X3D, RTX 4090, the games run reasonably okay at good quality settings and stuff, but most people don't have that, so then they're running it on lower-end systems where there's been no optimization and it runs terribly. But the thing is that people have still bought the game. So maybe there'll be some hesitance around like buying, there will be some people who are on the edge who are like, I'm not sure my PC can run this game, so I'm not going to buy it. But I imagine most people who are like really waiting for Starfield or something are still going to buy it, even if it runs averagely on their system. I think that's been the case throughout most, like, you think back in the day, people were running, like, I remember when GTA 4 came out on PC and that ran terribly, like really awful. This was during the like dual core era, but you really needed a quad core to run that game well. And people were still buying it, but they were just playing it at like 25 FPS. So I imagine there'll be some of that happening.
Okay, this is actually a pretty interesting one, Tim, that you and I have had a bit of a discussion about. But the question is, how do you guys feel about Nvidia's article breaking down VRAM on the 40 series GPUs? So we have some interesting insight into this, which I touched on in the RTX 4060 Ti review. But basically, we had a private briefing with Nvidia. They called us up, and we had a chat, Tim and I, with them about the upcoming RTX 4060, and they wanted to sort of give us their spiel about the card. And
it's a full presentation, like that, slides, everything.
Yeah, it was a two-way conversation though.
Yeah, it was.
So they let us know that they'd obviously watched our VRAM content, and while they didn't necessarily disagree with it, and they
had differing opinions at times about that content.
Well, they didn't really say they had anything they disagreed with the content. They just wanted to emphasize that it wasn't always a problem.
Yeah, they had a different perspective is probably a better way of putting it.
Which they also admitted that I said in the video that 8GB cards are still perfectly fine for gaming. It's just not a premium high-end experience. So it was kind of like a weird, we've seen your content, we don't want to say we disagree with it, but also the 8GB RTX 4060 Ti is just fine. It was kind of there's a fair way of going about it.
It was difficult, like you mentioned, it was difficult for them because they were launching the 16GB card at the same time and they had to talk. Anyway.
So basically, they were saying that we'd like you to be aware that the architecture has a larger L2 cache, and that helps with it was kind of like this weird, like it helps with VRAM access, not having to access the VRAM as often, which kind of hints at we don't need as much VRAM. But then they were sort of saying, but really it helps that we have a much narrower memory bus. So it helps increase bandwidth effectively, which we've sort of found to be a bit of a crock now. I mean, I'm sure it does that in some instances, but we didn't find that effective. It's not that effective. It obviously will result in a performance boost, but it's not really doing either of the things they sort of claimed. And it's certainly, what is it, 32 megabytes or something on that card? I can't remember what the L2 cache capacity is. It's quite small. That if you have 8 gigabytes of textures or 10 gigabytes of textures, your 32 megabyte L2 cache that's not where the textures are going. Useless. They're going out to the VRAM.
Yeah, so I think with this, the article that you're talking about in this question is very similar to what we were presented with prior to the launch. A significant portion of their presentation to us was talking about this cache VRAM access
They're
thing.
like trying to conflate the two.
And yeah, I think there was some confusion between the two issues with the card. There were really two separate things going on with the 4060 Ti. There was the 8GB VRAM capacity and the reduced memory bus. So 128-bit versus I believe it was 256-bit for the 3060 Ti. So with these two issues, I think there was this confusion where when they're talking about things like memory access, VRAM access, as you pointed out previously, there was this chart, we can probably put that up on screen, where they're sort of showing there's, with that increased L2 cache at Nvidia, we can reduce the access to memory by like 50% or whatever they claimed. And I think that was talking about memory bus access. So that means how often we need to utilize memory bandwidth to access components of VRAM. The most frequently accessed parts of the game, which are not textures, they're things like, game components. Those can be stored in the cache on the GPU, faster access. We don't have to reach out to VRAM to access those things. Therefore, we're reducing the amount of times we access VRAM. But what it doesn't mean is we now are loading textures into cache, therefore we need to we're not accessing as many assets, and there was that conflation there of sort of VRAM access in terms of time or bandwidth versus VRAM access in terms of how much VRAM we're accessing. And I don't know whether it was purposeful confusion or just accidental confusion, but there were certainly commenters on my announcement video and your review video that was sort of talking about, well, Nvidia said this in this article that, VRAM access is now reduced because of their L2 cache, and that was, being confused with the VRAM side of things. And like I said, I don't know if they were trying to talk about VRAM access to sort of minimize both the 8GB issue and the memory bus issue, but really it was isolated only to the memory bus concerns.
And there's like 3 or 4 different things going on there, right? Because, the larger L2 definitely boosts performance. But there's a latency and a bandwidth difference between the L2 and then the VRAM. So there's those components, and then there's how often you go out to the VRAM. But you're clearly always going out to the VRAM for games that require large textures, basically any game really. And then if the game requires 10 gigabytes of VRAM and you've only got 8 gigabytes, having a larger L2 doesn't help there unless you're talking about gigabytes of L2, which then that's a whole different ball game. So it was just weird.
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like it was a response targeting the VRAM concerns in terms of capacity that was actually talking about the memory bus capacity issues, which was kind of weird. Like, I'm sure Nvidia's thinking was like, people are going to bring up that the 3060 Ti is 256-bit memory bus and the 4060 Ti has 128-bit. People are going to notice that, the massive reduction in bandwidth. So let's talk about the L2 cache helping out to, they talked about their effective memory bandwidth and all that sort of thing. I'm sure that was their thinking, but I think, maybe the more generous read of it is that it was poor timing to bring up that argument when a lot of people were more talking about VRAM capacity and exceeding 8 gigabytes of VRAM capacity, going to 10 gig. What are the performance issues that cause? And certainly it caused confusion with people thinking the L2 cache improves VRAM capacity constraints, which it just...
A simple way of putting it is if it had like HBM2 memory, let's say, on that card, 8 gigabytes of HBM2, you had like over 1,000 gigabytes per second of VRAM access bandwidth to the... All that does is that if your memory bandwidth limited in terms of performance, that can improve the frame rate because the GPU is able to access and process that data faster. But if you have more data than you can fit in that 8 gigabytes and it spills over in a system memory, you still have the same problems.
Because that 1,000 gigabytes per second, that becomes irrelevant straight away. As soon as you're hitting system memory, the L2 cache, the size of it, the bandwidth to it, the bandwidth to VRAM, that's all irrelevant. It's PCIe bandwidth, system memory, that's where those constraints come in. And this is how caching has always worked. VRAM is a form of cache, but L2 is closer to the GPU with higher bandwidth. So, like with all assets, the CPU works like this as well with things like vcache and cache on CPUs. You've got very close to the GPU cache, then you've got your L2 cache, and then you've got, your VRAM, and then you've got system memory, and then worst comes to worst, you've got your physical storage like hard drives and solid state drives. And as you want to keep as much of the assets as close to the GPU as possible because that gives you the best performance. But again, when we're talking about games and VRAM and texture limits and stuff, we're not talking about the cache versus VRAM limit, which is irrelevant. We're talking about the VRAM versus system memory crossover. So again, that conflation where NVIDIA's talking about L2 versus VRAM threshold, and we're talking about VRAM versus system memory threshold. Again, it can be confusing if you're not fully up to speed with how those things work. And I'm not suggesting people have to know what those things are because it's definitely more of a low-level look at how GPUs work. But yeah, I think the NVIDIA article didn't really help the situation. They probably could have left it to reviewers to explain the memory bus side of things and how that, how the cache affects it. I think, the confusion that they introduced there with the VRAM capacity was not great.
I don't care how wide or narrow the bus is. I just care about the resulting performance. So if it has like a 64-bit bus, but you go up to 4K and the performance is amazing because they've got some sort of magic going on there, then it's like, okay, well...
like a 64-bit bus with HBM2 is probably going to run better than the current configuration we're seeing on
potentially. But yeah, I don't hone in on those exact specifications. It's the resulting performance is what matters. And we've seen with the narrower bus, they haven't overcome that with L2 cache because it's still slower than previous generation parts in bandwidth sensitive games, and then when you exceed the 8GB VRAM buffer, it turns to crap.
Yeah, I mean, 32 meg of L2 is not a massive amount. It's certainly much larger than they had with the previous generation, but we're not talking heaps of cache. Like, it's a small amount. It's a small die.
It boosts performance for sure, but it's a different thing.
On a 200 square millimeter die, they're not fitting heaps of L2 cache on there. So, yeah, I mean, I guess that's really our thoughts on that article. I don't think it really helped the situation. It can confuse people. It was... even sitting there listening to their presentation, I found it a little bit confusing whether they were talking about VRAM capacity versus memory bandwidth things, because certainly those were both issues. So, I think they probably could have... again, could they have dealt with it better? Because maybe confusing people was their goal. It seems like a fairly nefarious goal, but... a marketing ploy has to be to minimize the issues related with 8 gig of VRAM on that card. So
I think they sort of found themselves quickly in a position where the enthusiast community and everyone was talking about 8 GB of VRAM not being enough. And they're like, well, let's settle down here. We can sort of, walk that back a bit and ease people's minds on 8 GB of VRAM, and I think maybe that's what the article was trying to do.
Yeah, I think it would have helped if it wasn't titled like talking about VRAM, but if it was like, let's talk about GeForce 40 series memory bus.
Because it was much more about the memory subsystem as in bandwidth and latency than it was about VRAM capacity.
Yeah.
And again, that's why I thought they were trying to conflate the two.
All right, and that does it for our Q&A series for May, at least at this point. As I mentioned at the start, there's probably going to be some sort of Computex Q&A, which isn't going to technically be a May episode because it's probably going to be in June, but whatever. It doesn't really matter too much. There'll be more stuff to talk about later. But for now, these are the questions and answers that we're going to be doing. So hopefully you all enjoyed it. And yeah, if you want to support the channel, we've got our Patreon and Floatplane, as always. Links are in the description, and you get access to some cool benefits. Discord chat, we've got monthly live streams, which we'll be doing just after this, but it will be too late by the time
that's next month
you watch this video. But yeah, that will be next month. BTS content, probably some cool Computex stuff there. And is that it? Is that everything?
I think so. Yeah, Discord live streams, behind the scenes content, Q&As. Yeah, that's pretty much all of it.
That sounds about right. So yeah, thanks for watching. I'm your host, Tim.
I'm your host, Steve.
See you in the next one.